Hello, everybody. Welcome to our NITRO workshop today on managing item level permissions. I appreciate you guys joining. I'm going to give it probably another minute or so to have some folks join up who might be joining up late. I know we just got started about a minute past the top of the hour. So we have a few familiar faces coming on, so that's great. Good to see you guys. Thanks for joining these webinars, workshops. I know you guys are getting some good stuff out of it because you keep coming back, so that's good to see. Good. Let's see if it looks like, yeah, maybe a few more people will join, but I'll just go through the preliminary stuff to get started before we get into the meat of the actual presentation. I will let you know right now I'm not sharing my screen yet. I will be doing so shortly, so don't be alarmed. I will share it shortly. What we're going to cover today, actually, let me backtrack for a second. This is James Restivo with Croquet Software. Yeah, I think I know most of you guys who are joining up on the call now. And we do these workshops once a month, maybe a couple times a month to go over different aspects of NITRO, get you a little more familiar with different things that you can do with it. And today we're going to focus on the item level permissions, which you can manage through the NITRO Workflows, and we'll get going on that. There is a questions box in the GoToWebinar panel that you can pop open and ask a question at any point in time. If you missed a comment I made, or if you have a question about something, or if I went over something too quickly, we try to keep these fairly informal and interactive as well. If you want to go ahead and add a question in there at any point in time, feel free to do so. So we like to keep it interactive like that. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen now because I think we've got most folks on who are going to join. So I'm going to go ahead and share my monitor, and I'm going to be sharing a site, Permissions Workshop, a SharePoint site. We're just going to talk through how to add in permissions and set item level permissions automatically to documents, and this can be applied to lists as well. So we're going to talk about document library specifically because that's where most people have their document management issues. You need to manage permissions on a document itself. Maybe you're doing contract documents, maybe you're doing policies and procedures, maybe you're doing some other kind of document repository where you want to set specific permissions on those documents. Now, of course, you can do that through the SharePoint interface, right? So you can always go to, and hopefully everyone's seeing my screen now, please pipe in or ask a question if you can't. But the standard way you would do it through SharePoint is that you come in here, go to your document, go to manage access. So this is through the modern UI. The classic UI is going to be a little different, but similar in the process. We're going to hit a manage access link, and you're going to pop open this. It's going to be a dialog in the classic mode. In the modern mode, it's this right-hand panel. And I always like to go to the advanced section because that's a little more clear to me. It's just what I'm used to. So I always go to this advanced section. And this shows me exactly which groups and which people have access to this particular document. So I like to go into that specifically and see exactly what is there for the permissions. Now, of course, you can go into this at any point in time and control your permissions, manage your permissions by granting permissions. We can delete unique permissions. And this is all pretty standard SharePoint stuff that you can do out of the box. And that's all well and good if you have a small document library or if you have a small list. Now, what happens if that list gets really big or that library grows quite large? Now we need to start putting some controls around it and maybe some more policies around who can access what, at what level they should have access to it. You can see here we got a couple of groups that have full control access over this document, but we can set different levels of access through NITRO Workflows. So I'm going back into that document space over here, come back over here. And I'll show you there's a couple things on here, or just one thing really. We're going to keep it kind of basic to start out, but you can expand this concept pretty far as how you derive and direct that access. Now I'll show you a couple different ways to do it. So at the outset, what we're going to say here is that these are departmental documents. We have one repository for them. Maybe there's certain people who have ownership over all of them. They can see all of the documents, but then you want to target different groups within your organization that they only have access to this document, but not the others. So in this case here, we have a facilities onboarding procedure documentation. That's going to be specific to one group, but it could also have the C-level executives overseeing the whole thing or administrators seeing the whole thing. And typically when we set these up, I do recommend, if it's possible, it may not always be possible with the documents you have, or even the list items you have, but if it's possible to have an admin, kind of omniscient, omnipotent, omniscient, I guess is the right word, person who can see it all, then that would be I always recommend having that, so that way if there's ever any access issues or ever any question about who can see it, or how, you need someone to go and control that document, it's always good to have someone who can do that for any document that's in your list or any item that's in your SharePoint list. But to set this up, to drive the item level permissions, well, first you have to break inheritance, which we can do through NITRO Workflows. Then you have to grant permissions, which you can do through NITRO Workflows. And then you can always reset permissions if you need to. And I'll jump into the NITRO Workflow piece of it now, so you can see what that looks like. So go over to NITRO Workflows. I've created a few workflows here already for us to look at, and I'm going to walk through these in some detail. So first, we're going to look at the setting of the document permissions. So we're going to go into that one first, this bottom one here, setting document permissions, and we pointing to our list, which is a documents list or document library. It's kind of the standard one that comes with SharePoint, just the one we're using, but you could use any document library here. And we're going to do this for when the item is created or modified. So typically when you upload an item, you're not going to have the department on there. You might not have the metadata on there to control who has access to it. So that could be done through a modification, but if you do create it through NITRO Forms, you could also apply the workflow that way when it's created, but you could, more often than not, you're doing it when it's modified. In this case, we're going to set up a rule here to say that it should only run this workflow when that department field is filled out. So in this very simple scenario, what we're doing is saying there's a department field on this list, on this library, and if that's filled out, then we want to go and set permissions on our document. And we're doing kind of this is more of a kind of a brute force approach, and I'll show you a different way to do this, but this is kind of a way to do it where you can explicitly say, okay, we're going to look at this set HR permissions action to start. And we're going to set a permission when the department contains the word, the value HR. And we're doing contains because it's a multi-value a choice column on the list, on the library, where it could contain more than just HR. It could be HR, it could be payroll, it could be facilities, it could be any other department that we put in there. But as long as it contains HR, we can run this action, this particular action. And what that's going to do is it's going to run on the current item in their documents list, and it's going to grant user permissions. So this granting of the user permissions is all we really need to do. We don't actually need to set up a separate action to break inheritance. This grant user permission action type by default is breaking inheritance on the main list item. We could choose to copy the permissions from our parent if we wanted to do that. So that would grant additional user permissions on top of what's already there for the document library itself. That may come into play in some scenarios where you're controlling access. The people who have access to the library, you also want to have access to every document, and then you can copy, and when you have that set up, you can copy the permissions, and then you don't have to specify them in this users or group section. But if you aren't doing that and you specifically want to say, okay, only this group or only these people can have access to this item, that's what we're setting up here. Now, one thing to note is that the permission section, permission action, only has one permission level here, and we would need to set up different permission actions to set up different permission levels, which we can do. It's fairly easy. It's really easy to do it, actually. But in this case, we're going to keep it with full control for these folks here. And how are we determining these groups? Well, we're going to our address book here, popping open that, going to users and groups. We're going to choose the one that we want. So let's say, let me back up a minute. If I'm kind of starting from scratch a little bit, and I hit this address book, I'm going to choose my group that I want to add in. I'm going to type in HR, that's the name of the group. Hit OK. And you can see you can add any number of groups or any number of people into this in the same manner. So say we want the owners group, which are the admins for the site. We want to make sure they have access into this as well. So we can hit OK. That's going to grant full control on both these individuals for this document, any document where department equals HR. We're going to save that. In a similar way, you can set up the permissions based on a different department, payroll. Same idea, grant user permissions. We can set up the permissions on facilities. And so you kind of have to create each, this kind of what I call brute force approach. You would create a different permission action for each of the departments or each of the groups that you want to enable access for, and also for each of the levels. So, create this one for legal documents where we said, okay, we're going to have this legal team and these NITRO Workshop owners have access at the full control level, but we actually want to have a different group have read-only access, and that's pretty much everyone else. So we're going to put in here, we can reference that everyone except external users, or the everyone group, or those AD groups that you have, you can use those in here as well as SharePoint groups, and as well as individual users. We can set that in here, and then everyone else has read permission. So as many different permission levels as you have, you'd have to create different, manage permission actions for that. But the benefit there is it's a little harder to set up, but the benefit in the long run is that you don't have to think about it going forward. It's going to reset it. It's going to set those permissions on the fly. So I'll show you what that looks like. So we're going to look at this legal document one here for a minute. And I'm going to add a document to my list. And I'm going to pull over, let's say, termination policy. I'm going to mark that as in the legal department. So we're going to pull that onto our list. You can see the department's blank. We can fill out that department in a couple different ways. We could do the grid view. We could go ahead and edit the properties. For document libraries, you want to go to the More option, and then you can hit Properties from there. And then you can hit Edit to set your criteria. And we're going to choose Legal and hit Save. Now it's going to take a minute to run, so I think it's going to show me the standard access to start. So go to Manage Access. Yep, it's showing me the standard access. Go to Advanced, because I like that one better. And it's got the standard access. So it will take a minute to run the process, and it's already worked. So now you can see, based on those workflows that we had set up, everyone except external users gets read-only, legal gets full control, NITRO Workshop owners get full control. So there you go. It did it very quickly, and with a quick change in the setup, you can see that it changed who has access to that document. Now, if we want to go back and change who has access here, and let's say we want to make sure HR also has access to this document. So let's go here to Properties and Edit. And I'm going to click off HR. So this should work to apply the permissioning for both HR and legal for this document. Now again, it's going to take a minute to run, so might not see the change right away, but it should add in HR to this. This group is having full control. So it does take some time to run. Now you don't, well, that's while I'm refreshing this, let me just tell you that you don't have to necessarily, well, the workflow can be invoked when the item is modified, which is what we're doing. We're saying when this item changes, when some value changes in this item, or you can specify what value changes, or you can just do it whenever the item's modified. We're going to run this workflow to process the change in permissions. It's just taking a little longer than usual. But you might want to do that on the fly, like on an ad hoc basis. And this could come into play if you're setting permissions on items or document library that you've already created. You've already got the criteria, you've already got the metadata on there. You're not adding new items. You want to go and apply these permissions on items that are already there, that already have the metadata in place. In which case, you're going to want to I'll show you that in the workflows. Oh, there it goes. Okay, it's set to HR, and I think it's going to set it to legal also. It should at least. Now maybe I set my workflow wrong. See, I said equal instead of contains. So that's the difference there. So if I set contains legal, it's going to rerun that workflow, and I'll show you. So I'm gonna do contains, right? Okay, so instead that's why we want to use contains, because that was a multi-select choice column, and that's where you use contains. If it's just a direct one choice, you can use equal, and that's okay. You can see how it failed. It didn't work to apply that permission for legal because I had the wrong setup there. That's okay. But now, all right, I want to go back and change it, but I don't necessarily need to actually change anything about my item. Well, what do I do? Well, what we can do here is go back to our workflows, and we can look at this workflow we have here. I'm actually going to cancel out of this one and look at it from this level here. You have the export option. So you can always export your workflow, and it's going to save it as a file to your downloads. And then you can upload it again. You can see we have a second one here I've already created, and I'll create a new one just to show you how it's done for the user and bot triggered option. So, and I'll show you how that interacts with how we can make that happen. So we create a new workflow, and we can do set permissions ad hoc, just give it some name. And we're going to choose our library again, which is going to be documents. And we're going to upload that file we just downloaded. So we just hit select files. It's going to open up your folder. You can go navigate to your downloads folder, get the one that you want to add in there. Was it this one? Set contract permissions. Let me back up a second here, make sure I download the right one. Set document permissions, that's the one I want. Set document permissions 3. Oh, okay, so it just was going in order there. New workflow. Set permissions ad hoc. Okay, documents. Select files. 3, that's one I just created, hit open. Then you hit the upload button. And you see it's already added all of the permissions that you need down here at the bottom, right? And the difference now is that we're going to change the option up here to go to user bot triggered. And I'm going to uncheck scheduled and just leave the user bot triggered as on there. And then I can actually save this. So then what we can do is go to our custom actions and invoke the workflow. So I actually already have a custom action on here, but I'm going to open up custom actions to show you what that looks like. Go to custom actions, set document permissions. All we need to do is have one action in here. We can enable it for multiple items using list view. We can put on the display form if we want. And then all we're doing is coming in here and setting document permissions as an invoke workflow action, give it a name. We don't have to put any conditions around it because the workflow already has the conditions. And then we just choose that workflow from our dropdown here. You see there's one I just created, and here's one that we already had going. So I'm gonna leave that one. So now I can come back to my list, and we come to our termination policy document here. You can see we've got the HR permission, but not the legal permission because the conditions are incorrect. Well, now I want to go and fix that. So now I can click on that one, and you can certainly select more than one. And we go invoke our custom action, hit that one, set document permissions. That's going to invoke the workflow. So now that workflow will run, and it's going to reapply those permissions to get this to also have legal to get access to it as well. So again, it's going to take a minute to run. It usually runs once a minute, I think, for the workflow. So if it doesn't happen immediately, it's going to take about a minute for it to actually do what it needs to do. But you see, it will change eventually. But in the meantime, that is a way that you can both set it for, and we'll come back to our workflows here for just a minute. We can set it for the items as you go through and modify them and add new ones and add that metadata around it. And then you can also invoke, basically copy that workflow and invoke it from a custom action so that you can always go back and apply that same change on the fly. You don't have to go and make a modification to the item anymore. Now I can go and invoke that workflow and make it, kind of force it to go through the process. So you can do those things, and it might be long enough now to have applied it. No, not yet. Of course not. Of course, in demos, it's always going to take longer. Okay, well, that's okay, because the one other thing I want to talk about here with these workflows, you'll notice on the workflow that we have enabled here, there's one other one we haven't talked about at the top here about resetting permissions. So as I was going through this, I created some different types of permissions, changed things around. I noticed that the permissions I'd originally applied weren't getting wiped out. How do you wipe out those original permissions? Well, you can do that through the delete unique permissions option. So I created a manage permissions action, manage permissions action, no conditions around it. And I simply went through and said, okay, we're going to delete those unique permissions. And what this does is it basically deletes the permissions that item had, sets it back to where it was originally, and then it's going to go look at the rest of these actions and apply those permissions and break inheritance and kind of do it over again. So it's going to reapply the inheritance and then break inheritance again in the same workflow. So again, all automated. You don't have to think about it. You just have to think about what criteria you want to put in place to drive who gets what access to that particular document. Now, I talked about this as sort of a brute force way to do it, where you're kind of explicitly saying, okay, the HR permissions are set up because it says HR. Payroll permissions are set up because it says payroll. Facilities permissions are set up because, et cetera, et cetera. There's another way to do this, which might work in a lot of other scenarios. And I'm going to kind of introduce two different things here. There's going to be the setting up the permissions on a subset of documents rather than directly on the documents library. And this is more in line with what we do with our contract management tool out of the box, is you have your contract list, which is a regular SharePoint list. And then you have your contract documents, which is a separate list. And I have that set up over here where you have this contract SharePoint list. And then you have these contract documents, and just have some dummy documents in here that are connected to that contract item through this related contract lookup field. So what we can do with that is use a combination of query list and our manage permission actions to drive who has access to these documents. So we're not controlling access at the contract at this level. Everyone has access to this stuff. But who has actual access to the contracts? Well, we're defining that based on the information in the contract record itself. So we're taking the information from here and saying, okay, everything that's associated to this like contract wrapper, I guess you could call it, right? Got this wrapper around this contract, this group of contracts that says, based on this metadata, these are the people who should have access to this item. So we're kind of doing two different things here. Where we're saying, okay, we're taking, it's not on the document itself anymore, it's at a different level, but we're still applying the concept. But the other thing we're doing here is directly saying who should have access rather than using the permissions, the manage permissions action and the workflow to drive, explicitly saying if department equals HR, set it HR. If department equals legal, set it legal. In this case, we're explicitly saying, here are the people who should have access to this item. So if I open up this contract wrapper, you could say, you see I have two contracts related to it. And we're directly saying the contract owner is James Restivo. We're directly saying the contract owner's group is HR. So the way we set that up from the workflow perspective is we come back over to our workflows and cancel out this one. And go to these contract permissions. And I'm going to pull up the one. You can see I did a copy and created the bot triggered one as well. We're going to set our contract permissions. We're going to do it at some do async workflow for when it's modified or when it's created. And then you see far fewer permissions here because now we're dynamically creating or saying who gets permission based on the information in that contract item. So first of all, we're going to do a query list, and hopefully most of you are familiar with query lists. If not, it's a really great, powerful tool to go and get a collection of items or to identify one specific item to take an action on that's not on the same list as where you're actually invoking the workflow, right? So we're on this contracts. Let me back up for a second. We're on this contracts list, not the contract documents. We're on a contracts list, but now we're going to use this query list to go and get those contract documents related to that contract, right? So we can go, could use a lookup column if you wanted to do that. You could use a query builder. We could directly build the query through Camel, or you could build it through the condition builder we have here. You could choose a list view. There's lots of options here. We're going to choose related items because now when we look at that contract, you can see we already have these two contracts as related items to this main contract document, main contract wrapper. So we come in here, we do a QL to get the contracts, and that's all we need to do. Now we can use that to manage our permissions. And the main one here is the set owner permissions. You can see we've also had that reset permissions option here. As I just explained before, that's so you can delete out those unique permissions and get it kind of back to 0, and then reapply permissions as needed. So we come in here, we set owner permissions, and now we're dynamically saying, based on users in these columns, and just back up for a second because it's, we're give it a name. Now we're pointing it to the query list instead of the current item. We're going to do the same grant user permission option here. And then we're going to use our address book and say, we're going to look at these users in the column instead of directly choosing a group. So it gives us a way to kind of make it more dynamic, make it a little more flexible in determining who gets access. It makes it a little easier, from an administrative perspective, honestly, because then you don't have all those different actions that you need to set up for each group or each thing. Now you are still going to need a different permission action for each permission level that you want to apply. So if we wanted to go and apply read permission to a different group, we would have to set up a separate permission to do that. And that's not that big of a deal, but it is something to keep in mind as we're setting this up. So now I can explicitly say, not only is it good from the administrative perspective, but now we're explicitly saying on this document itself, you don't even have to go and look at the manage access, because kind of by design, these are the people who have access, and that's basically it. So you can go to that contract document. Let me open that up. And we'll look at the manage access for this one contract document. And we go to advanced because I like that one. You can see it's HR James Restivo. That's it. You already know that's set up because that's what you set up in your workflow. But and it's on the contract item. But you can go and verify that's all who's getting access. Now again, you can go and change that by going to your contract item, making an edit, and changing that level of permission. So all you need to do once you got that permission set up, now all you need to do is change the access at this level. It's going to be James and Scott have access to it, both of these documents. Hit save. Now that's going to run the workflow because now we've modified this item, and it's going to kick off that workflow to reapply the permissions. Again, if we wanted to do that on a kind of force that reapplication, well, first of all, we will have to create that custom action to do that. And we do a quick custom action for that, where you do set document permissions. We'll enable it for the list ribbon. We'll enable it for multiple items. We do in our invoke workflow option here, and set document. And we're going to choose Crow Canyon, and then we set contract permissions ad hoc. Hit OK. And that's all you need to do for that custom action. Then we come back over here, refresh this, click on that item, And now you see that there's that workflow. We can go and run that on an ad hoc basis if we need to. I already ran it, so you don't necessarily need to do it again, but in this case I am. And then it's going to run that and kind of force that change. So kind of gives you another way to force that permission application on those items. Now again, we're applying it over here on the contract documents. Let me go check my permissions over here. And you see there, Scott has access now because I said he should. HR, which has admin account, you saw that in there. James and Scott have access. Now I can go and remove that, of course, and just, if I go and change this again, edit this item here, remove Scott, save it. Now that's going to run it again, and it should reset the permissions. Now, based on previous experience, I'm not going to sit there and refresh it. I do want to check the termination one that we did earlier. This is that termination document. Didn't never reset. That's interesting. All right, I'll have to check that one out. But it's going to remove. Oh, I already did it. See, it removes Scott's access. On that same one. So come back here, contract one. You can see it here. Let me refresh and manage access. And you see there, it removes Scott's access. So again, simple changes through the the UI, the form itself. It impacts the permissions once you get these set up, and it gives you a lot of control over who has access to what based on criteria and set up in the in the either the contract wrapper or in the contract document or in the metadata of that document. You can control who sees what. So just to close out on a couple other things, because we really just talked about two ways of using managed permission, which is the deleting unique permissions, which we're doing with the reset, kind of resetting it to 0 and then reapplying permissions. And then we also did the grant. Those two, for the most part, are going to be the ones you're going to want to use. But there are a couple others. I'll just show you what they do, and there might be other use cases you can come up with where those would come into play. Now, there could be a situation where you simply just want to stop inheriting permissions, and then maybe another process will apply permissions, or you just want to apply permissions manually. You can just do a simple stop inheritance of permissions on the item. And we try to make it pretty explicit over here on the right what's happening. But we're basically stopping permissions. I think if you do this without copying permissions, though, you're going to basically be left with an item where no one can access it. You don't really want to do that. So if you're stopping inheritance, you want to make sure you're copying permissions, or if you know who you want to have access to it, I would use the grant permissions instead of the stop inheriting permissions. Again, kind of limited use cases, which is why I didn't talk about this one too much. But there is an option to just straight up stop inheriting permissions for an item and then just copy it from the parent, and then you can go and manually set up your permissions if you wanted to do it that way. And the other one, which could come into play, probably a few more use cases for this one, is removing user permissions. So you could have a library or a list of items where you want everyone to have access anyway, but there could be certain situations or certain scenarios where you want to remove access for certain individuals or certain groups. And that's where the remove user permissions is going to come into play. This could actually, a good use case for this is, we have a knowledge base in our IT help desk. And there's a flag on that to say it's for internal users or external users. And external users meaning people at large can go and consume that document and take a look at it and see what it's all about. Internal users meaning IT staff only should see it, and the end user shouldn't necessarily be able to access it or search for it and see what the content is. So in this case, that use case, what you'd have is a document library where by default everyone has access. If it's external, everyone has access. If there's no indication, everyone has access. But if you mark it as an internal only, then you can go and break inheritance and remove the user permissions for like the visitors group or the everyone group or whatever group you have as your end users. You could go remove that permission. So that could be a use case where you want to use this remove user permissions for items that are specifically intended for internal users only. But in general, by default, everyone should have access to that document library. So you really only want to, set the user permissions for those certain documents, not necessarily every document. So Those are the couple other options with managing permissions at the item level. Now, again, there are other avenues for setting permissions on items. Within the form itself, you can set column permissions. Within the within the form, you can have tab permissions. You have section permissions. That's more, we can talk about those, but that's more geared towards the Nitro Forms use of the permissioning, where you can control who can, actually set values in a form. This is more about at an item level, who can actually access or see it. Now, of course, if you break inheritance and you set unique permissions, people can't even see that item at all, which is really great for if you have tightened security and you really want to make sure that only certain people have access to certain things and certain documents. Okay. So we did have a question over here if we see any performance issues with using unique permissions in large document libraries. This is a great question, because it is something that SharePoint recommends to avoid, or at least I've seen in the past, and I haven't seen necessarily any updated guidance on this. You want to try to avoid having too many item level permissions within one document library, because it could cause performance issues. I have not explored that recently. I do know a few years back, it was a concern and was a problem when you have too many item level permissions. Every item has different access. It's just kind of makes sense that the server would kind of choke up, because it's got to go and check, okay, does this person have, what are the permissions on this particular item for this particular person who's logged in? And it has to go and check to, basically, does this person have access to this item? It's a lot of load on the server. So I can't imagine that guidance has changed terribly much. I will look into that and get back to you offline on that question, if we've seen any, or if SharePoint has any guidance, or Microsoft has any guidance for large document libraries with lots of items in it for item level permissioning. But yeah, I mean, as far as I know, it's still going to be a bit of a concern when you have lots of items with these things. Now, that being said, that's, that only comes into play when you're accessing the items and viewing them. So there could be scenarios where it's, if it's really just a document repository, it might not matter as much, because you're not doing a lot of business processing on those documents. You're just simply storing them, setting your permissions around them, and saying, okay, only XYZ has access to these items, or these other items. And it doesn't, performance doesn't really impact the user's ability to go and view the items. Maybe it'll take a little longer to load. That might be just, just something they'll have to deal with. Now, if we're talking about putting business processes in place on that large document library, beyond that, that's where you're probably going to get into a little bit of trouble, because I think it will choke up and will have a performance impact. If you have will have a performance impact, but in reality, you might not have a lot of business processing happening in those same libraries where you have a lot of those individual documents happening. Now, that's actually another good reason to have the setup that I was just talking about here, where you have a list that determines what the permissions should be, whereas your document library has the actual permission set up, because you're processing, and maybe you're changing of permissions, or managing of excuse me, who has access to what, is happening from this contracts level, whereas actual contract documents, maybe would rarely need to be accessed, once in a while, once a week or something like that, not every day, and not a lot of them. So that's another reason that this contract, kind of separation with the metadata in one list and the actual contract and document itself in another list would come into play, and it might make sense for your kind of setup and your way of managing things. All right, so that's a great question. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to pop into the questions box. But that pretty much covers what I wanted to cover with the managing of item level permissions using NITRO Workflows. This is going to be applicable to both on-premises and Office 365. I know sometimes we have workshops that kind of focus on Office 365. This is applicable to both. This is going to be there for your on-prem environments, 2013, 2016, 2019 environments, and it's going to be there for your Office 365 environments as well.
Okay, well, James, just to pipe in, you focused on document libraries, but this applies also to any SharePoint list, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I use document libraries because I think that's going to be what most people would use this for, but this would apply to lists as well. So if you have, it comes up fairly frequently actually when we have our HR request management system with a customer. HR tickets by design are going to be sensitive, right? You're going to have, maybe it's a disciplinary issue, maybe it's a termination issue, something they don't want a lot of people to know about or have access to. And those particular scenarios, you might want to set up item level permissions to say only the person requesting this HR request and the HR group should have access to it. That's where using that field of setting permissions and saying the requester would have access to it and the HR group would have access to it, but no one then in that case no one else would have access to it. So yeah, absolutely, it can apply to lists as well as libraries.
Okay, good.
All right, good. So with that, if there's any other questions, feel free to pop them into the questions box. I'll get to them. I'll get them answered. But to see what's coming up in the next little while here, I know I put one out for September. I guess I haven't made the website yet, but we do have a couple of workshops coming up. One for building application portals using the NITRO Studio web parts, where we're going to walk through the different modern UI web parts and classic UI web parts that we have for building out those types of portal situations. And then we're probably going to be throwing in an ad hoc webinar at some point. I mentioned it on the last one about the custom actions designer. Going to give you a sneak preview of that, but we're going to set up a workshop just for that one specifically when that's released. So keep an eye out for that. We'll send an email out to you guys when that one's scheduled, so you can sign up and get on that one. Otherwise, let's see what else is going on. We have some other workshops, other webinars coming on. We have our was it Summer Breeze series. We're going to talk about building out an expense reimbursement system within NITRO. And then we're going to talk about building out project and task management within NITRO, coming up in next week, July 22nd, a very important day in Crow Canyon. It's the, well, anyway, I won't say why it's important, but very important day for Crow Canyon. And then August 26th, there'll be this next webinar about project and task management. So that's a couple things coming up, and that's about it. Did you have any other things to add, Scott?
No, yeah, there's upcoming webinar. Yeah, you covered it. That's good. Good workshop. Thanks for presenting that. It's
Sure.
Good information.
Sure. No problem. Thanks everyone for joining, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Okay, bye.